State of the Industry podcast. And here we go. This episode is brought to you by KP Movement Education, your source for health and movement education and coaching. Whether you are a health or fitness professional, a fitness consumer, or perhaps a passive bystander, KP believes that everyone deserves the right to pain-free movement. That's why their memberships and services are designed to educate, empower, and inspire you to create a culture of movement for yourself and those around you. With 2 membership options, you'll find education surrounding developing at-home training programs for yourself or for others, mental health and exercise, lifestyle medicine, and much, much more. Check it out at kineticperformance.ca/memberships. That's kineticperformance.ca/memberships. Welcome back to the State of the Industry podcast. I am your host, Adam Youngsma. For the next 2 episodes, we dive into the science behind exercise, or more specifically, the science behind cardiovascular physiology with our guest, Dr. Greg duManoir. Dr. duManoir is a tenure-track instructor within the School of Health and Exercise Sciences at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Kinesiology and a Master of Science from the Faculty of Physical Education and Recreation at the University of Alberta. He received his PhD from the University of Western Ontario. Dr. duManoir has held a number of teaching-related positions, including Sessional Instructor at the University of Alberta and College Professor in the Human Kinetics Diploma Program at Okanagan College. While his training is in cardiovascular physiology, he has a wide breadth of knowledge on the interaction and response of human physiology during exercise. Greg and I discussed the role of altitude training, the effect of training mass, the different adaptations that occur within the body as a result of different stimuli, as well as several other topics. I know I learned a lot during this discussion, and it also reminded me how much I forgot since my years in undergrad, so I know there will be a lot of practical information for you as well. On a side note, in his free time, Dr. duManoir enjoys wine, hitting the slopes, and long bike rides down muddy mountain trails. Without any further ado, let's dive right in. All right, so welcome, Greg, to the State of the Industry podcast. How are you?
I'm doing well, Adam. How about you?
I'm doing very well. School semester starting up, so really busy this week, and I know you are as well.
Chaos.
Yeah.
The storm before the calm, maybe?
To say the least. I'm less nervous before teaching live than I am online, and so this is going to be a new challenge for sure.
Says the guy who runs a podcast. You should have all that technology piece down.
I have all the technology pieces. Whether or not the teaching side of things is fine-tuned enough to call me an expert on it, I don't know about that.
Yeah, I hear you.
Remember, I just post the audio of this. I have to actually teach, how do you take blood pressure and heart rate? You don't have anybody besides you. How do you teach this?
That's right. That's right.
So that's going to be a challenge. But anyways, so before we get into some of the topics that we have, can you just give a little bit of a background about who you are and how you got to be where you are right now as faculty at UBC?
Yeah, can I just say by absolutely no planning and total luck? Hopefully, we call it maybe planned happenstance. I don't know. Yeah, so I'm an associate professor of teaching at UBC's Okanagan campus in the School of Health and Exercise Sciences. And so I teach everything from active health, health and well-being, exercise physiology, laboratory techniques, tissue injury and repair, functional anatomy. And I've been teaching for 10 or 12 years now. Prior to coming to UBCO, I was at Okanagan College, which is a sort of small transfer school in Penticton. And that's a 2-year program that, takes care of the first couple of years of a university degree and then sends all the students off to university to complete their degree. And then prior to that position, I was a graduate student. So probably go back even further, and the 6 foot tall white kid realized his dream of being in the NBA was never going to happen, and couldn't get away from sport and sport performance. So I had entered into a Bachelor's of Science degree at the University of Alberta and kind of hated every second of that first semester, and decided, you know what, I'm going to transfer into phys ed.
Yeah.
And so closed all my books, didn't study for final exams. Maybe I shouldn't tell this story as an educator, but yeah, didn't study for any exams. Went to the phys ed office and said, what does it take to get in? And they said, well, you have to get this grade and then you can be accepted as a transfer student. So I went back and started studying for my final exams again. But I couldn't enter phys ed until the following year and only take kind of open courses.
Yeah.
So my first phys ed courses were squash and
Nice.
volleyball and basketball and applied resistance training, and just kind of fell in love with it. Kept going through the degree, and in my fourth year, had an opportunity to do a research project as a class. And then just fell in love with the research process, collecting data, working with subjects, answering a question. Decided to pursue a master's degree and stayed at the U of A for that. And then again, still enjoyed that whole process. Thought I would be a physiotherapist at some point. And just as I gained some more experiences, thought, it's not really what I want to be doing. And at that time, the brilliant job of the sports physiotherapist was really hard to come by.
Yeah.
In Edmonton, it was the Glen Saylor Sports Medicine Clinic, and there was 3 physios working there. And still to this day, those same 3 physios are working there. They've expanded a little bit, but I realized it was maybe not quite what I wanted. So decided to do a PhD. And in the course of the PhD, realized that I didn't want to write grants and chase the research dollars. So I started focusing on the teaching side of things. And then, sought out some opportunities to become hopefully a stronger educator. And like I said, it was never really planned. Just opportunities kept coming.
Yeah.
And I just kept taking them, and it, got me to this place that I am today, working and playing in the Okanagan. And I say I wouldn't wish my path on anybody else, but it got me exactly what I want. So yeah, I'm ecstatic to be here. I think something else I'd probably share about those is just kind of trying to be a connector and meeting with people, and bringing a positive attitude to those meetings. So, good example of that is came to the Okanagan, didn't know anybody, started looking up people who own facilities in the area. I was on strengthcoach.com, found a guy named Chris Collins who had a facility here, reached out to him via an email, went and met him 3 days later, ended up chatting for 5 hours. And with we had planned the Okanagan Strength and Conditioning Conference.
Nice.
And about 6 months later, we had emails going out to guys like, Charlie Weingroff and Joel Jameson and these types of guys. And somehow everybody said yes and came out to Kelowna to deliver these workshops. And, the next year we did it again, and the next year we did it again. So I've had some good opportunities by that type of approach. Again, just, not in the plans.
Yeah.
One more story for that too is colleague working at UBC here when I was at Okanagan College. He was planning a research expedition to base camp at Mount Everest, and he had a whiteboard on his wall that said, "People going to Everest." And I just jokingly wrote my name on it, and it never got erased. And I got invited to go to Nepal for 6 weeks to do some high altitude research. And, you know, the question I always asked him was, why did you bring me? And he said, well, you're a good guy and we need a little bit of that when you're at 5,000 meters and everybody's going crazy. So
I love it. I love it. Yeah, it's interesting. So you mentioned that your first kind of experience in your undergrad was your quarter credit, you know, squash and resistance training. I loved my first year at Laurier. So I took the arts versus the science route in there because my end goal was actually to become a phys ed teacher. And so the quarter credit, like the arts program, the arts stream was much better suited for that kind of direction versus something more sciencey like a physio or an osteopath or chiropractor. And so I went into the art side and I loved, as you did, I loved those quarter credits. So like that's actually what grabbed my attention as well. I always had the idea that I wanted to do something in the health field, but I went in wanting to be a phys ed teacher. I left wanting to be a physio, and I am neither. Right. So I do the same thing. Like I teach and very similar to you, it was a lot of just right place, right time, knowing people, and putting in the work, and I guess being good at what I did kind of got to where I am teaching at Centennial College as faculty there, being able to open my own company and teach my courses kind of across the country and present across the world and in conferences. So like I've been blessed to be able to do that, but like you probably wouldn't wish how I got here and the amount of jumping around. Like I moved almost every single year to the next opportunity. Because I was almost so unsure about what I actually ended up wanting to do. I was waiting for that thing to go, that's what I want to do.
Yeah, I think it's about that accumulation of experiences, right? And you know, maybe going back to your comments about those, you know, quarter courses or physical activity courses or applied methods courses, or even bigger than that, let's call it our phys ed degrees. You know, you don't see that phys ed degree very often anymore. Everybody's kind of shifted towards bachelor's of science in kinesiology or a human kinetics degree or kinesiology degree. And I think that's great. I mean, the science focus is really important. And I think we do a very good job of preparing healthcare practitioners or allied health practitioners. What I think we're missing these days, though, is that like coaching aspect, the activity aspect, the movement analysis aspect, and maybe the communication pieces. And I think, I mean, you might be able to say the same thing, but I think I was successful in those opportunities because I was able to communicate really well. You know, both from a coaching perspective and just, you know, face-to-face conversation. But we'll see how the rest of the podcast goes if I can communicate really well.
I'm sure you'll be great. So at UBC, are you currently doing research? And if so, what are you kind of looking into right now?
Yeah, so what's unique about my position is it's a tenured teaching position. So UBC has two parallel streams. One would be your traditional research professor, that 40-40-20 split of research, teaching, and service. And then the teaching stream, which is a little bit more teaching focused, and then what we call educational leadership. So the idea behind educational leadership is to do best practices in teaching. Now, doing research doesn't really count towards that, but that's not stopping me from doing research. So I supervise or co-supervise a couple of grad students, and it's across a bunch of different areas. So my background is sort of cardiovascular, cardiorespiratory physiology. Master's degree was really focused on cardiac function, and then PhD was focused on sort of oxygen transport. And so I've stayed in that area. We've got some world-class researchers in sort of respiratory function and cerebrovascular physiology. And those guys combine that with some altitude work. So, trips to Nepal to go to 5,000 meters to work with that sort of Tibetan or Himalayan high altitude native, trips to Peru to work with Andean high altitude natives, and new stuff that's coming up is to try to get to Ethiopia to work with some of the Rift Valley high altitude natives.
Yeah.
So there's some of that, and it's all really cardiovascular related, whether it's heart function, blood vessel control, brain blood flow and metabolism. And then the other part of my research is actually a little bit more in that sort of applied sports science area.
Yep.
So I work with our women's varsity volleyball team, and we do some sort of player monitoring, wellness. We use the MyVert system to track their volume and intensity of jumps in a practice and competition. So I get to work with undergraduate students that way. They take on some undergraduate research projects where they are sort of managing the data collection and analysis. And for a small school, we've got a pretty successful women's volleyball team. So
nice.
Prior to becoming a university, they won the collegiate nationals twice, and then have been to the sort of youth sport nationals once in the last few years. So
nice.
Yeah.
So lots of success. I like it.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually want to start off with diving a little bit into what you were talking about, some high altitude training. And
Sure.
I'm going to take this from kind of two different directions. So the first is with the current pandemic and the push towards having face masks, or the face shields and stuff. One of the things that I was looking into is doing, because I don't do this research on my own. I didn't focus on cardiovascular cardiorespiratory system as a whole. But one of the things I was looking into are those, now they're not called altitude masks anymore. They're more like resistor masks.
Mm-hmm.
And, a lot of the research that I was looking at about those and the actual usefulness of them actually had nothing to do with like the response that you get from altitude at all, because the actual percentage of O2 doesn't change in the air that you're breathing. It just restricts, like makes it more difficult. So before we dive into the altitude piece, can you just speak to those masks and what a possible benefit, if any, could be to wearing one of those during training?
Yeah, I'll maybe show my bias right away. I think you should save your money. But if you've got one already, I think the mechanism by which they could provide some adaptive response is by providing, like you said, that resistance to inflow and resistance to outflow. So I kind of joke that these masks simulate chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So, if you want to give yourself COPD, they work great. So, really what that means is if you got a sort of restriction or obstruction to flow, is you're going to have to recruit accessory respiratory muscles and your main respiratory muscles, diaphragm, to a greater degree when you're wearing them. So if you think about, just a sort of general adaptation syndrome approach, you've put an external or a greater load on those respiratory muscles, and hopefully the adaptation would be to improve their strength and maybe their efficiency. So I think from a logic perspective, that makes a little bit of sense. But I think the thing that we really have to be aware of is if you're using a training mask, I think the quality of your training is probably going to be negatively impacted for some of the other responses. So if I'm doing some type of cardiorespiratory activity, whether it's continuous steady state in nature or if it's an interval based activity and I'm wearing that mask, one of the things that happens is because your respiratory muscles are working harder, you get a phenomenon called respiratory muscle steal. And what that means is that more blood flow is being diverted to your respiratory muscles as opposed to going to your exercising muscles. So you get a lower O2 delivery to, let's say, the muscles that are cycling. And likely that has a negative impact on the sort of metabolic adaptation in those sort of peripheral muscles that we're trying to make an adaptation to.
Yeah.
So if you're going to use them or use the mask, I think you have to have a really targeted approach to your training and give up some of the potential peripheral impact for the potential benefit.
Yeah.
I think if you want to do some respiratory muscle training, there's some other devices out there like the Power Lung or the Spiro Tiger. And I think those guys have shown a little bit more of a positive impact on respiratory muscle function than sort of those altitude masks.
Yeah.
But when I was in my master's degree, we did some work with the Power Lung, and we didn't really find any performance benefits in a group that used the Power Lung for sort of 10 weeks.
Okay.
And a group that didn't use the Power Lung. But again, that's just one study, and there's some studies that have shown positive impacts as well. So
yeah. I also think with that, because you mentioned one of the pieces is that you're going to have a negative effect on whatever the training outcome that you're actually going for. So, it's almost like you're trying to get two different adaptations to the same amount, but you're having to take away from one to add to the other. And I also think about this too, is that once you start to get to the point where it's getting harder and harder to bring in air, well, most of the time you're like, we're taught to breathe through the nose as much as possible for the benefits that provides. But the nose can only pull so hard, and then the mouth is going to start to go. So, are you then teaching your body to then start breathing through the mouth when you're really gasping for air like that?
Or earlier in the
intensity. And then and then the other piece is you're trying to strengthen the muscles that do your let's just call it inspiration first. And well, a lot of those accessory muscles are ones that you don't want to be on, because that's going to then lead to stress breathing, right? Or overemphasize that if you currently do something like that. So while you may be trying to target the diaphragm, you may actually be getting kind of scalenes, upper traps, sternocleidomastoid, masseter, all those trying to actually elevate and expand that rib cage as well.
And I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing to make those muscles stronger.
Yeah.
But like you said, I don't know if you want to engage them earlier in a like progressive intensity exercise kind of environment.
Yeah.
I think it's like the Dan John line about managing options and compromises.
Yeah.
So if you're going to do that respiratory muscle training, you're probably compromising some other adaptation. But if that's what you want to do, then just be aware that that's what's happening.
Yeah.
But you're right. Those masks have absolutely nothing to do with simulating altitude.
Yeah.
So
yeah, because I think originally they were called altitude masks, and they've now changed the name. I can't remember what they call them now, because I didn't waste my money. So I didn't actually get one. All right, so let's now dive into a little bit about altitude training, or altitude, the effects of altitude to begin with. So can you just go through a little bit of what happens to the blood specifically, with its ability to hold and pull in oxygen when we start, because we always talk about live at altitude, train down, like, so live high, train low kind of thing, to see the actual effects of altitude on the body. So can you just talk from a physiological perspective, what actually happens when we are living at altitude?
Yeah, so I think it's probably a good idea to say the live high, train low approach, I think works relatively well in probably moderately trained or untrained individuals, although I would put that at like the kind of top of the hierarchy of training. I don't think I would just like go do an altitude camp if I haven't managed like volume and intensity of training and those types of things.
Yeah.
I'd say the evidence is maybe a little bit less convincing if you're already an elite athlete. But there's some ways to determine if that live high and train low would actually work for you.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea behind live high, train low is that you spend sort of upwards of 16, 18 hours a day living in either a low oxygen environment or a kind of lower barometric pressure environment. So you can move to high altitude, probably between 2,000 and 4,000 meters is sort of the suggestion. Under 2,000 meters, you're probably not going to see much of a stimulus. And then above sort of 4,000 meters, while the low oxygen or low barometric pressure is a really big stimulus for those sort of cardiovascular adaptations, it has quite a large negative impact on sleep and recovery.
Mm-hmm.
So being above 4,000 meters is probably not recommended. The other way you can do it is just by removing oxygen in the environment. So there'll be hypoxic generators, altitude tents, and the way they simulate altitude is just by removing some oxygen in the environment. So rather than breathing about 21% oxygen, we drop it down to about 12% oxygen.
Okay.
And so in either case, what tends to happen is that we're exposed to a lower pressure or partial pressure of oxygen. And that partial pressure of oxygen is really the driving force to get oxygen into the lungs and then across the blood gas barrier into the blood and then pump to the tissue via the heart. So hopefully if you've taken a physiology class at some point, you'll remember the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve.
Yep.
And the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve is this like S-shaped curve that relates the saturation of hemoglobin in the blood to the partial pressure of oxygen that blood is exposed to. And then we can do some math from that and calculate the content of oxygen in the blood, both that's bound to hemoglobin and that's freely dissolved in the blood. Now, that oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve works really well when we're at sort of lower altitude, sea level to, let's say, 2,000 meters. We do a really good job of capturing oxygen onto the hemoglobin and then being able to transport it and offload it to the muscle. But when we have a partial pressure of oxygen that drops kind of below about 100 millimeters of mercury, sort of down to 60 millimeters of mercury, we have to have some adaptations because we're not very good then at loading hemoglobin with oxygen. And so we reduce the saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen, and we also reduce the content of oxygen in the blood. And those two variables are really tightly controlled. And so there's a whole bunch of physiological adaptations, well, let's say adjustments, things that happen really quickly, and then adaptations, things that happen over a longer period of time that combat that reduction in partial pressure and content. And so some of those things that happen pretty quick is, in order to maintain oxygen delivery when the content is low, heart rate jumps up.
Yeah.
So when you go to altitude, you'll have a really acute increase in heart rate. That works to deliver a little bit more oxygen, and maybe at rest and submaximal exercise, that's sort of a good thing. But if you start to do maximal exercise, or if you go really high, heart rate can only increase to, that mythical 200 beats per minute if you're a 20-year-old.
Yeah.
And then after that, you can't deliver any more oxygen. So the next adaptations are around trying to increase the content. And so another thing that happens really quickly is your ventilation rate goes up, both from a rate and a depth of breathing. So that sort of heart rate response and the ventilatory response happen within sort of minutes to hours. While those things are really good at sort of maintaining your ability to do some submaximal and maybe a reduced maximal exercise, they're not really the things that you want to happen from an adaptation perspective. So if I wanted to be able to go faster or do more at altitude, I need some other things to happen. Now there's some things that happen with your blood volume and some management of your acid-base balance, and your kidneys play a big role in that, but we'll leave that sort of stuff aside for now, and we'll just sort of target the main adaptation, which is red blood cell content or hemoglobin content. And so within a couple of hours of being at altitude, you have again, through the kidneys really is this stimulation for red blood cell production. And the idea behind that is that if we can make more red blood cells, which carry the oxygen, we can then increase the content of the oxygen in our blood. And so what you tend to see after a longer time at altitude is an increase in hemoglobin concentration, or you could measure it as hematocrit, or you can measure it as red blood cell volume. And so the live high part for that sort of 18 hours a day is to stimulate the production of red blood cells. The train low piece of that is that, remember, if I'm at altitude and I do some submaximal activity, I'm relying on an elevated ventilation and an elevated heart rate to get a lower intensity of work compared to what I would be doing at sea level. So we drop down to sea level to do the training, and then we go up to altitude to get that long-term exposure. Now, a couple caveats to that really are, if you're going to compete at altitude, so Tour de France is going on right now, lots of stuff in the Pyrenees and the Alps, and those athletes are exercising at altitude, then we should probably expose the athletes to that environment to be placed under stress. And so the big push for this came from the 68 Olympics in Mexico. As a sort of post hoc analysis, they realized that no world records were set in endurance events, probably anything greater than 1,500 meters. And the times were quite a bit slower than the previous Olympics, despite improvements in equipment and training. But sort of explosive and throwing events, world records were set in almost all of those events. So the resistance to those implements was removed, but the reduction in altitude or reduction in oxygen at altitude was a negative impact. So that's sort of where we see these, high altitude natives doing some impressive things at altitude, because they've had, generations of genetic adaptations to living at altitude. So if you look at the Tibetan or Nepalese highland natives, they have a really good sort of ventilatory response to high altitude. And so they're really good at maintaining an oxygen driving pressure. And it's incredible how those guys do not get tired at altitude. The impressive feat story was when I was there, the Everest Marathon was going up. And so basically you run from Everest Base Camp down to Namche Bazaar. And people go there for months to train for that at altitude. So you go from like 5,300 meters down to, I don't know if it's just under 3,800 meters, I think Namche is. and some, Nepalese Sherpa porter shows up in flip-flops and wins the race in 7 hours. And these guys who've been training for months, it takes them 10, 12, right? But these are accomplished marathon runners. So it's impressive what they can do. And that's a different adaptation than the Andean guys, who they have just a higher red blood cell content right from birth.
Yeah.
So they're really good at carrying oxygen. The problem is it creates really thick blood. And so you see Andean high altitude natives kind of dying early from cardiovascular disease. They have high cardiac work throughout their life. And then you see sort of Tibetan or Sherpa highland natives, they're dying from sort of hardship diseases, really bad arthritis and these kinds of things. Not that you die from arthritis, but it impacts your ability to perform the work that needs to be done.
Yeah. I find that interesting that similar altitudes but different regions have different adaptations to basically the same stimulus. Right. Any idea why that is?
Oh, yeah, that's the question for my colleague Phil Ainsley. I mean, he's the guy that's been sort of studying this for his entire career. And yeah, off the top of my head, I'm not sure what the genetic stimulus was to create that difference.
Yeah.
I believe it has to do with some genetic adaptation that just, kept perpetuating itself. But again, like you said, it's such a different adaptive response.
Yeah, that's really cool.
But it goes to show the integrative nature of oxygen transport, right? So if there's any one of these systems that has a sort of decrease in function, maybe another system can increase to maintain that sort of flux through the system completely.
Yeah, I'm always like, when it comes to specifically professional sports, so you mentioned the Tour de France, but even when I look at basketball or hockey here in North America, when you go to somewhere like Colorado to play, so Denver, you always see the visiting team struggle a lot more in that altitude environment than, say, the Denver Nuggets or the Colorado Avalanche, who play there more regularly. And yeah, it's really interesting because you mentioned that there's not as big of a difference when it comes to elite athletes, and yet even the small little difference that you see there, right? Because they're all very, very elite athletes, but one group of them live there and the other ones just kind of visit there, even though they're still, and you still see a little bit of a difference in fatigue and ability to recover throughout those games.
Yeah, so I think that's a little bit different with the sort of acute response versus the adaptive response. So if you're an elite endurance athlete who already has a high red blood cell content, altitude training probably isn't going to work as well for you. Mm-hmm. So if your blood's already got 15, well, let's go higher. If it's already got 18 grams per 100 mils of blood, if it's got 18 grams of hemoglobin per 100 mils of blood, going to altitude probably isn't going to raise that much more. Whereas if you've got 14 or 15, going to altitude is probably going to raise that up towards 18. So this was the whole EPO, erythropoietin thing in professional cycling in the late 90s. This idea that if you took erythropoietin or if you did blood doping, you would get an increase in your red blood cell content. And yes, that works. And so then what the governing body did was they said, let's measure people's hematocrit, so the ratio of red blood cells to plasma volume. And if it's over 50, people can't race. And so if you were a successful cyclist with a hematocrit of 42, and then you took EPO to get it to 49, you became a monster.
Yeah.
But if you were a successful cyclist before taking drugs and your hematocrit was 49, taking drugs didn't make you any better. And so all the guys that were successful with the 42 who now got hematocrits of 49 left you in the dust.
Yeah.
Now the part about showing up to Denver and having some, physiological adjustment responses or increased fatigue, there's some management of that stuff that can be done. It's kind of inevitable. And I'm not quite sure again what the travel schedules look like.
Yeah.
For the athletes, but there's this idea, if you showed up a couple of days ahead of time to a week ahead, you'd probably ameliorate some of that fatigue because you'd have those early adaptations. The other option is just to show up a couple hours before and hope for the best.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I mean, if teams are arriving the day before, having a morning skate or a shoot around, and then playing that evening, they might be in that window where the negative impact is being realized.
Yeah.
Whereas if they showed up to town 3 hours before the competition, obviously that doesn't really work with the way the schedules are set out. It might not be as big of an impact on them.
Interesting.
So.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, right now there's no travel, but yeah, back when people were traveling into Denver.
Yes.
Yeah, because I always wondered that, but it's also interesting when you were talking about the resistance in the air is lower. So when you look at something like football, for instance, and you look at, field goals, all the records are always set at Mile High Stadium, right? Because
home runs in baseball too.
Yeah, like least resistance to the actual object itself. So it's very interesting.
It's interesting that timeline. I had, again, when we were traveling before, I had the privilege of going down to do Institute of Motion course in Denver, just outside of Denver. And it was the anatomy-based course with the untreated cadaver dissections. And then the last day was like, the movement stuff with Michel, who I think was recently on the podcast.
Yes, he was.
So got to spend a few days with that group, but I came out a few days early and I decided that I would explore the cycling in and around Boulder.
Yeah.
So the first day I got there, rented a bike, rode 120 kilometers. Second day, rode another sort of 80 to 90 kilometers. And then the third day, I decided I would cycle up Pikes Peak. Okay. So that's a 35 kilometer uphill to 14,000 feet. And I was riding at like 4.5 kilometers an hour at the top.
Yeah.
Hardest thing I've ever done in my life, from an endurance perspective.
Yeah.
But I think I blew it. If I would have done Pikes Peak the first day, I probably would have felt a little bit better because I had spent sort of 2 to 3 days at altitude already. Plus it accumulated a whole bunch of fatigue from the days before.
Yeah.
But I got to the top and it was one of the worst moments of my life because this guy got up and he's like, bucket list done. And I said, oh, me too, man. And he goes, yeah, never thought I'd get up that thing twice in one day.
Oh, that's awesome.
Put my tail between my legs.
Yeah. I love it. So the last thing that I want to chat about with regards to some of the stuff that you were talking about is you mentioned the Ethiopian Plateau, indigenous people there, and those regions in Africa have always been phenomenal. Like when you look at Kenya, Ethiopia, like phenomenal at endurance, long distance activities, marathons, ultra marathons, whatever it is. And this may go back to this, be overlapping with the question I asked before, but have you guys looked into that? And like, is there a genetic adaptation that they have that allows them to be just better at that than, anybody in like North America specifically who trains to be a marathoner?
Yeah, so what's really interesting is that there's been a lot of work done with those Himalayan or Tibetan high altitude natives. There's been quite a bit of work done with Andean high altitude natives, but there's very little work having been done with that sort of Rift Valley group. From a physiological perspective, I'm not aware of the genetic studies that have been done in those groups.
Yeah.
At least not to just pull from my brain right now. I'd have to look those up. And one of the reasons is it's really hard to get to those groups of people, or it has been really hard to get to those groups of people in the past. Obviously now this sort of way, that's maybe not the right words, but the way to make a living in Kenya and Ethiopia now is to run yourself into a contract with, Nike or some other sort of elite running group, or to get yourself a scholarship. So what we see is these groups of people with, high altitude exposure from birth, with the sort of genetic, longer than Himalayan and Andean altitude natives. So the Rift Valley natives have been there for, probably thousands of years more than the Tibetan and Andean high altitude natives.
Okay.
So there's probably something in there about the number of generations. But then I also think it's this like nature nurture piece.
Yeah.
Everybody's running, and everybody's running lots of miles, and they have this maybe polarized training approach where they're doing their sort of low intensity days at a really low intensity.
Yeah.
But then their high intensity days are ridiculously fast. And then they kind of also bridge those with these days where they just have this progressive increase in intensity. And so you've got Eliud Kipchoge, the world record holder in the marathon, and the Ineos and Nike kind of breaking 2 thing, where he's done a sub 2 hour in a artificial environment. So he's the man, right? Entered 11 marathons, won 10 of them or something like that. And he still does the training runs with everybody. And the idea is on this like progressively intense day, they'll start the day with 100 or 150 athletes. And then as the intensity goes up over their, however long the run is, 30K, the last guy running is Kipchoge. Like the intensity just goes up so fast that he's the last man standing. With this, again, the story being people who try to hold on are the ones that get noticed. So I think they do some really good training.
Yeah.
And then they've got this environment where it's the sort of carrot is to get noticed by running. Then they've got their genetic predisposition. But I think we're going to see that population change really quickly because, people are moving to the cities, and, lots of North Americans and Europeans are going to train with them.
Yeah.
So that environment is changing quite a bit. I wish I had more from a physiological perspective. As a group here, we had an expedition arranged for last fall that got pushed back a little bit. Then it was supposed to go in the spring, and obviously with COVID, it didn't happen. So
yeah, I also wonder if there's when you look at, so we're talking kind of the physiological with regards to the cardiovascular, cardiorespiratory system. But even if we look at like, it would be something to look at, but if there's bone, muscle, tendon, fascial, genetic changes that have occurred there as well to make them more efficient at the actual running process as well. Like, whenever I talk to students, I'm always like, train kind of the way that you want to look, right? When you look at marathon runners, they're very slender, they're narrow, they're almost boxy. And then you look at sprinters and they're large, you know, when we're looking at the difference between type 1, type 2 fibers as well, right? And so it's really interesting to talk about that as well, and like the changes that have probably, or the adaptations that probably occurred over, as you said, generations and generations with regards to muscle fiber and tissue density, like all those types of things.
Yeah, I would imagine that they have a really high proportion of type 1 fibers. You know, probably some of the highest we'd see from a population perspective. I can't remember if it's Dan Lieberman. Specifically, he's a like biomechanics researcher out of Harvard, and I think he wrote Story of the Human Body.
Yeah.
Or if it was in the sports gene. But they address a paper that looks at inseam length.
Okay.
And I think the story is that Michael Phelps, who's what, 6'6" or something like that. And I don't know if it was Kipchoge or if it was a previous marathon world record holder whose name is escaping me right now. Placed side by side. Let's just call it Kipchoge for now. He's like 5'7", 5'6". And if you take the inseam length of both Phelps and Kipchoge, they're the same. So as a percentage of their total height,
yeah.
Let's just make a sweeping statement that these Rift Valley natives have really long limb lengths.
Yeah.
Which allow them to have greater stride lengths and be much more efficient. If we coupled that with type 1 fibers, their efficiency is really high. And then if we call them having large hearts and big lungs, really high hemoglobin contents, then, you know, that's the recipe for an unbelievable endurance athlete. Whereas you take Phelps with short legs, but a long torso and really long arms, that's the design for an excellent swimmer.
Yeah. And it'd be interesting too to see them compare somebody like Usain Bolt, right, to that as well, because still requiring long limbs, but different muscle fiber type makeup in there, right? More power oriented than kind of, you know, stride length. Well, stride length is still important, but anyways.
Yeah, well, I mean, from a Usain Bolt perspective, I think stride length and stride frequency, because his stride length is so long, he has to take fewer steps, but each of those steps can be maybe a little bit more powerful.
Yeah.
Given his type 2 fiber concentration.
Yeah.
I think what's hard though is that, you know, we're comparing Phelps and Kipchoge and Bolt, who are like, they've been touched by the hand of God. So like, I don't know if it's impressive for sure, but
not necessarily the recipe.
I can't make my leg length any longer.
Yeah.
And I tried to make my heart bigger, but that didn't happen over the years of training. So
I love it. All right. So the last thing that I kind of want to talk about in part one here is continuing along with the conversation that we're currently having about optimizing the training for the specific outcomes that we're looking for. And like, we'll just stick with endurance sports, endurance events here. And you mentioned some stuff about the Ethiopian highland indigenous people and how they are doing some of the training. So what would be optimal training for somebody who is wanting to get into, we won't say they are already, but wanting to get into perhaps working their way up to running a marathon over time, and wanting to actually do reasonably well in it and not just be like a finisher, but actually compete in that? What would your recommendations for training be?
Yeah, I mean, you have 14 weeks. I mean, we do a whole course on that. So I guess with that in mind, I think, you know, we'll say all of that stuff around, you've done some really good assessment. You've talked about, you know, their goals. You've made sure that they're, you know, robust enough to be able to handle some training stress, like if it's running, for example, that sort of repetitive action. And, we could talk a little bit about resistance training for endurance athletes, but maybe we'll keep that aside for now. The literature and some of the sort of coaching approaches would suggest that there's two ways to attack this. The first way that's kind of getting popular or has been popularized in the last little bit is this polarized training approach. Really brought to light by a researcher out of Finland. Steven Seiler is his name. And basically what he did was he did a retrospective study on all of the sort of elite performers in the Olympics within endurance events. So being from Scandinavia, he looked at cross-country skiers, orienteers. He did some cycling, some running, and he just looked at training logs from these individuals. And what he found was that they spent probably 80 to 90% of their training time in a low intensity environment, with the remaining 10% of their time spent doing high intensity work. So the way they divide up the intensity zones is really based around sort of the lactate threshold, or the sort of ventilatory threshold 1 and 2. So the sort of low intensity training would be below that first threshold, below sort of 2 millimoles of lactate. And then the high intensity would be above 4, or that sort of ventilatory threshold 2. And really the stuff in between, they don't do much of at all. So it's low intensity for a really high volume, and then it's high intensity for a really low volume. So this sort of statement of keep the low low and keep the high high.
Yeah.
I think the thing that's really important to note about these elite endurance athletes is that their high is unbelievably high. The speed, the power output, velocities is ridiculous. Because again, they're the ones who are touched by the hand of God.
Yeah.
The other thing that we have to remember about these guys is that they're essentially professional athletes. So they have as many hours in the week to train and recover as there are in the week.
Yeah.
Whereas most of us who are starting to train for an endurance event, we probably have work, kids, dogs, managing COVID environment. So, either in the COVID environment, you've got a lot more time to train, or you've got a lot less time to train. So the thing I think we have to remember with sort of your average Joe is this idea of they're probably more of a time-starved athlete. And that time-starved athlete probably has, let's call it 6 hours a week to train. Maybe a little bit more if we include like a long run on Sunday morning. But I think it's hard for people to wrap their head around, am I going to spend 80% of my 6 hours doing things that are really slow? Like my heart rate's around 110 beats per minute.
Yeah.
I don't feel like I'm doing anything. I don't feel like I'm getting bang for my buck, or this isn't no pain, no gain. But we have to remember that it's a really good stimulus, even though it's a low stimulus.
Yeah.
But then when you do the high intensity stuff with the time-starved athlete, it has to be really, really hard. And so now we're balancing this like, okay, that was so hard that I don't know if I can walk tomorrow, kind of thing. Or, exercise shouldn't make me throw up. I'm not advocating that we make people throw up, but, we need to have the intensity be hard. So the other approach then to this training is, rather than having this like polarized approach, we really have this threshold-based approach, or something that would be considered more like sweet spot training.
Okay.
And so this sweet spot training is to find this like power output or velocity that's like right below that sort of anaerobic threshold. You know, critical power might be another term that people might have heard, and I'm not sure we want to open that Pandora's box right now. You know, what is critical power? But you kind of want to work at, let's say, 90-ish% of that anaerobic threshold for a bunch of your training sessions, and then add in some recovery days and some days that are a little bit harder. So, you know, the polarized training approach is like a U shape.
Okay.
With a really high end towards the low intensity, and then the sort of sweet spot or threshold base is an inverted U, with most of the training being in between that sort of VT1, VT2, LT1, LT2.
Yeah.
And the idea behind that is that the stimulus is just hard enough to see some broad-based adaptations, but it's just low enough that you can recover from it on a regular basis. Now, which one would I advocate? I don't know. I think it would be really dependent on the athlete that I'm working with.
Yeah.
You know, I find, again, N of one, anecdotal evidence from myself, I find that the polarized training works really well.
Yeah.
From an adaptation response, but from a mental perspective, I get tired of staring at the wall on my bike trainer for hours, right? And living in Kelowna, it's kind of hilly, so it's really hard to get a kind of low intensity training session in.
Yeah.
You know, but I also want to say that I'm not this like advocate that everything should be high intensity.
Yeah.
I believe that high intensity interval training, for example, is really important. But all the evidence in the literature around HIIT training is done on, you know, 6-week studies or 10-week studies.
Yeah.
And the, you know, muscular, metabolic, and cardiorespiratory adaptations are really profound in those 6 weeks. Like Marty Gabala's study looking at, you know, multiple wing gaits over just a 2-week period. I mean, the improvement in VO2 max and anaerobic threshold was incredible from such a short time. Now, it was a 30-second wing gait, all out effort. There was a bike sitting at the side of the fitness center. Beside that bike was a garbage can.
Yeah.
Beside that garbage can was another bike, and then there was another garbage can. And they just had athletes coming in, or subjects coming in, doing a 30-second wing gait. They got like 3 minutes off, 3.5 minutes off, another 30-second wing gait, 3.5 minutes off. And so you got to think the intensity of that is so incredible. And they needed a garbage can right beside because the metabolic byproducts were so strong that people were throwing up.
Yeah.
I don't know if I want to take my average Joe client through that intensity of work. And I know for sure that 2 weeks of that stimulus works really well, but I'm not sure if I could do that for a 3rd week or a 4th week or a 5th week.
Yeah.
You know, and there's another great study out there. Guy's name is escaping me right now. Anyways, they did really hard interval work 3 days a week. And then 3 other days a week, they sent everybody out for a threshold run. And so they did 6 days a week of training, really high intensity. And it was a 10-week study. And everybody's VO2 max was going up. Every single participant at multiple time points over the study had improvements in VO2 max threshold efficiency. And so at the end of the 10 weeks, they applied for an extension through ethics at the institution, got the extension, and then asked the subjects if they would stay in the study because they hadn't plateaued in their responses yet. Every single one said no, it was too hard. And most of them said they barely held on, but they felt responsible because they had agreed to it.
Yeah.
You know, so those types of studies work, but I don't know how how well we can maintain that super high intensity work, repeated. So I think it's important to blend in that low intensity training as well.
Yeah. So you kind of answered one of the questions that I had, was that physiological benefit to doing the high intensity within that polarized training model, right? Like a lot of people think, well, if I want to run a long distance, I got to run long distances. Like that's what I'm going to do. And there's actually a few individuals in the strength and conditioning, training field who speak to the benefits of more high intensity training over and probably something more towards that sweet spot training that you were talking about, where you're pushing a lot harder, more high intensity, whether it's high intensity steady state or high intensity interval is an argument to be had later. But they do something more high intensity because you get a lot of the same benefits as you were saying with VO2 max at that high intensity, instead of putting in that long-term slow low intensity effort. If that isn't your, like, so if running isn't what you're going to be doing, maybe you're a hockey player, doing some grabbing an Aerodyne bike and going high intensity would benefit you quite well. Going for a 10K run maybe isn't worth the time that you're putting in to do that, is kind of the viewpoint of a lot of them. Do you have
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would agree with that for the most part. Again, it's this like managing the time you have available to train. From a performance perspective, I'm sort of a big believer that athletes should be practicing the technical and tactical aspects of their sport as much as possible.
Yeah.
Or they should be recovering from whatever type of training and competition they've experienced in the last little bit, or they should be spending time with their family. Right? Like, I think those should be the three main priorities. So, oh crap, I'm a university professor who's training people to be, kinesiologists, sport performance specialists, and I just said that I don't think athletes should be training. That's not really what I mean. I think that athletes need to go do resistance training and energy systems training to supplement their technical and tactical environment, to help with their recovery. But again, if I can sell to LeBron James that if he does resistance training, mobility work, energy systems training, then I might be able to keep him in the league for another 2 or 3 years. Like, that's $400 million for that guy.
Yeah.
Right. But if I can also say, look, we've done enough that now you can go home and be with your family, like, you can't buy that time, right?
Yeah.
And maybe that's just me because I have, a 12 and 15-year-old daughter who now sort of want nothing to do with me, and I just want to spend more time with them. But I think we need to be efficient with our training. Now, if we look at it from a physiological perspective, again, let's take maybe an interval-based sport like, basketball or hockey. The cardiovascular system is pretty important both for the work periods along with the recovery periods. So I think we need to spend some time on that. And if we think about O2 transport and utilization, there's a bunch of different places that we need to train. So, lungs, I don't know if we can train the lungs very well. They tend to be a really overbuilt organ because they're exposed to the atmosphere. We can't make your lungs bigger. It's really hard to make them better at diffusing oxygen. But as we had that conversation earlier, maybe we can improve respiratory muscle function.
Yeah.
Next step is that heart, right? So the chamber size, the efficiency for with which it pumps, preload, afterload, contractility, all of those types of things. Size of the chambers, size of the walls, those are really important. We go to the blood vessels, and now we're looking at their compliance and how well they distend and contract. We look at the, blood itself, the amount of red blood cells, how well we bind oxygen. And we go down to the muscle level and we look at the capillarization, and the diffusing distance for oxygen. And then we go into the muscle, and we're looking now at sort of mitochondrial size and function. And if all we're doing is the high intensity interval training, we're probably really spending most of our time looking at the sort of mitochondrial and muscle side of things. There's some evidence that it improves cardiac function, but I don't think it improves cardiac function as well as some of the longer steady state stuff does.
Okay.
So again, this is like, where are you targeting?
Yeah.
And maybe it's sufficient for an athlete to target the muscle and mitochondria if they're an interval-based athlete. I would argue that oxygen delivery and transport is still pretty important. But I'm also a big believer that if that athlete was exposed to lots of sports as they were growing up, so, you know, they're the kid who joined the running club in elementary school and ran around the school in the mornings. You know, they played floor hockey, they did soccer, they played basketball, they rode their bike. They probably developed their cardiovascular system sufficiently to support that O2 delivery and muscle mitochondrial function. But if all they did was play hockey and did intervals and you know, shooter tutor against the garage, something like that, and then just went to hockey, I don't know if they've developed that system well enough, and they might be well served by some of that longer duration activity, and let's call it the off season, or, you know, it doesn't have to be sitting on the bike for 2 hours. It can be some kind of multimodal activity where the heart rate's maintained at 120 beats per minute for 30 minutes, let's say. Or it's the longer bouts of interval work that last sort of 30 to 45 minutes, where the heart rate doesn't get to recover between exercise bouts that may cause that sort of cardiac adaptation. Right? But hopping on the Airdyne for like 4 2-minute intervals with 2 minutes of rest, that's probably not a big enough stimulus for the cardiac side of things. It's probably a good stimulus for, well, that's probably a crappy prescription, because a 2-minute interval is going to be very glycolytic, and we probably don't want to be glycolytic very often in sports, especially hockey. I say if you're the hockey player that gets on the ice and skates full out for 2 minutes, you're probably a really bad hockey player.
Yeah, that's probably very true. Very true. That just brings me back to the beer league hockey I'm missing. All right. So just looking at time, let's, I think that's a great place to break. I actually wrote a whole bunch of notes, so I got a whole bunch more questions to dive into this topic a little bit further, and we will do so in part number 2.
Awesome.
State of the Industry Podcast.